My name is Paul Timmons. Back in 1968, I was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. I was 22 years old when I set foot in Vietnam for the first time. I had grown up in a small town in Kentucky where the farthest I'd ever been from home was the next county over. It was a different world back then, and the war was something I thought would never touch me. But when my draft notice came, I decided I'd rather enlist. At least that way, I'd have some control over where I ended up, or so I thought. When I arrived in country, we were stationed near a place called Phu Bai, just south of Hue. It was hot as hell, and the humidity made it feel like you were walking through soup. The jungle wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive, full of sounds, smells, and movement. It felt like the earth itself was trying to swallow us whole. Our job was to keep the supply routes open and disrupt the Viet Cong's operations in the area. I didn't know it yet, but that year would test me in ways I could never have imagined. I carried an M16, a rifle that was supposed to be state-of-the-art, but had a bad habit of jamming at the worst times. We all knew about it and did our best to keep the barrels clean, but the mud and grit of the jungle had a way of finding its way into everything. My gear wasn't much, just the basics. A few grenades, some extra magazines, a poncho, and a canteen. We traveled light because speed and stealth were our best weapons. One of our first assignments was a patrol through an area known as the A Shao Valley. It was a dense, mountainous region that the Viet Cong used as a major supply route. The place was notorious. Soldiers called it Death Valley, and for good reason. It was crawling with enemy fighters who knew the terrain better than anyone. I remember one day in particular. It was mid-April, and the monsoon season had just begun. The rain was relentless, turning the jungle floor into a thick, sucking mud that made every step a chore. Our squad was tasked with finding and destroying a weapons cache that intel said was hidden somewhere in the valley. There were 8 of us, including our squad leader, a guy named Sergeant Conway. He was older than most of us, probably pushing 30, which seemed ancient at the time. He was the kind of guy who didn't say much but had a way of making you listen when he did. The first few days of the mission were uneventful. We moved carefully, trying to stay off the main trails where we knew the enemy would have booby traps waiting for us. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call put us on edge. The Viet Cong were masters of camouflage, and you never saw them until it was too late. On the 3rd day, we found what we were looking for, or at least we thought we did. There was a small clearing up ahead, with what looked like a makeshift hut built into the side of a hill. Conway signaled for us to fan out and approach quietly. As we got closer, I could see the place was abandoned, or at least it looked that way. But something felt off. The jungle was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. We split up to search the area. Inside the hut, we found some AK-47s, a few crates of ammo, and what looked like maps or plans written in Vietnamese. It was a solid find, enough to put a dent in the enemy's operations in the area. But then, as I was standing guard outside, I noticed something, a thin wire, half buried in the mud, leading away from the hut and into the undergrowth. My stomach dropped. Tripwire! I yelled, but it was too late. There was a deafening explosion, and the ground seemed to vanish beneath me. I hit the ground hard, my ears ringing and my vision blurred. When I came to, the scene was chaos. Smoke and debris filled the air, and the sharp crack of gunfire told me we were under attack. When the ambush started, it was like the jungle came alive. Bullets were snapping past us, chipping bark off trees, and kicking up sprays of mud. The Viet Cong knew this ground like the back of their hand, and they used it to their advantage. We were pinned down before we even had a chance to react. I was lying flat in the mud, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My M16 was caked in dirt from the blast, and I didn't even have time to check if it would still fire. All I could do was pray it wouldn't jam when I needed it. Conway's voice cut through the chaos, shouting for us to form a perimeter. The rest of the squad was scattered, but we managed to regroup near the hut. Conway was barking orders, trying to get us to hold the line. The Viet Cong were relentless, using hit-and-run tactics to keep us disoriented. They'd fire a burst from one spot, then disappear and pop up somewhere else. I spotted movement in the trees ahead and squeezed off a few rounds. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, but I couldn't tell if I hit anything. The enemy was like ghosts, there one moment and gone the next. Then I saw Ramirez, one of the younger guys in the squad, clutching his leg. Blood was pouring through his fingers, staining the mud beneath him. He was trying to drag himself toward cover, but he wasn't going to make it. Without thinking, I scrambled over to him, keeping as low as I could. "Hang on, buddy," I muttered, grabbing him under the arms and hauling him back toward the hut. My muscles burned with the effort, but adrenaline kept me moving. Bullets whizzed past us, one so close I could feel the heat of it against my cheek. When we got back to the others, Doc, our medic, was already working on another guy who'd taken shrapnel to the chest. His hands were steady, even though the rest of him was covered in sweat and mud. "Over here," I called out, laying Ramirez down. Doc glanced up, his face grim but focused. "You did good, Timmons," he said, before turning his attention to Ramirez. I didn't have time to feel relieved. The enemy was pressing harder, their fire getting closer and more accurate. I found a spot behind a fallen log and started laying down, suppressing fire, trying to give the others a chance to regroup. That's when I noticed something strange. The gunfire from the enemy's side was thinning out, like they were pulling back. At first, I thought maybe we were pushing them off, but then I saw it, movement in the treetops. "Look up," I shouted, but it was too late. The Viet Cong had set up ropes and platforms high in the canopy, and they were using them to get above us. One of them dropped down like a shadow, landing just a few feet away. He was holding an AK-47, but before he could fire, Conway spun around and took him out with a burst from his M16. "They're flanking us," Conway yelled. "We gotta move." We grabbed what we could carry and started falling back toward the ridge. The terrain was rough, and every step felt like a fight. The rain had turned the slope into a slick, muddy mess, and more than once, I slipped and went down hard. By the time we reached the ridge, we were exhausted, but at least we had the high ground. Conway ordered us to dig in, using whatever cover we could find. The enemy was still out there, but they seemed hesitant to follow us up the hill. It gave us a chance to catch our breath and take stock of the situation. We'd lost 2 men in the ambush, and 3 more were wounded, including Ramirez. Doc was doing his best, but his supplies were running low. I could see the strain on his face as he worked, knowing there was only so much he could do out here. Conway radioed for support, but the response wasn't what we'd hoped for. A supply chopper was on its way, but it wouldn't be there until morning. That meant we were on our own for the night. We set up a defensive perimeter and tried to make ourselves as invisible as possible. The jungle at night was a different beast altogether. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. I was on watch when I heard it, a faint rustling in the undergrowth, followed by a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. At first I thought it was an animal, but then I saw the glint of something metallic. I raised my rifle and scanned the area, my finger hovering over the trigger. That's when I saw them, 2 Viet Cong soldiers creeping toward our position. They were almost completely invisible, their bodies painted with mud and leaves. I waited until they were close enough, then fired. The first shot hit the lead soldier square in the chest, and he went down hard. The second one froze for a split second before disappearing into the trees. The gunfire brought the rest of the squad to full alert. Conway was at my side in an instant, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Good eyes, Timmons," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. The rest of the night was tense but quiet. None of us slept much, and by the time dawn broke, we were all on edge. When the supply chopper finally arrived, it was like a weight had been lifted off our shoulders. The pilot dropped off ammo, medical supplies, and rations before taking the wounded back to base. Watching that bird disappear over the horizon, I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. But there was no time for that. We still had a job to do. After the supply chopper left, we packed up and moved deeper into the jungle. The enemy knew we were here, and staying in one place too long was asking for trouble. Conway's plan was to take a less obvious route back to the rally point, avoiding the main trails where the Viet Cong would be waiting. It wasn't the fastest way, but it was the safest. The jungle closed in around us as we pushed forward. The air was thick and heavy, and the constant hum of insects felt like it was drilling into my skull. Every step was a slog through mud and roots, and every shadow seemed to hide something waiting to pounce. We kept our formation tight, with Conway at the front and me bringing up the rear. My job was to watch for anyone trying to sneak up on us, but it was hard to stay focused. The jungle had a way of messing with your head, playing tricks on your eyes and ears. A few hours into the march, we came across a stream. It wasn't much, just a trickle of water running over moss-covered rocks, but it was enough to refill our canteens. We took the opportunity to rest for a bit, keeping one man on watch while the others caught their breath. As I sat by the water, I couldn't help but think about the guys we'd lost in the ambush. I hadn't known them well, but it didn't matter. Out here, every loss felt personal. I try not to dwell on it, but the memories had a way of creeping in when you least expected them. We moved out again after about 20 minutes. The stream led us to a narrow ravine, with steep, vine-covered walls rising up on either side. It seemed like a good place to avoid detection, but it also felt like a trap. Conway hesitated for a moment before giving the signal to proceed. We were about halfway through the ravine when I heard it, a faint clicking sound, almost like a camera shutter. I froze, my heart racing. I'd heard that sound before. "Stop!" I hissed, holding up a hand. The squad halted, and Conway turned to look at me. Before he could say anything, there was a loud click. "Climb what I mean." The explosion was deafening, a wall of sound that slammed into me like a freight train. I was thrown backward, my rifle flying out of my hands. When I hit the ground, it felt like the air had been knocked out of me. For a few seconds, I couldn't hear or see anything. Then the pain hit. My left arm felt like it was on fire, and my head was pounding like a drum. I forced myself to sit up, blinking away the spots in my vision. The ravine was chaos. Smoke and debris filled the air, and the sharp crack of gunfire told me the ambush wasn't over. The Viet Cong were pouring fire down on us from the top of the ravine, and we were sitting ducks. Conway was already shouting orders, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get to cover! Moo!" I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my rifle, which was half buried in the mud. My arm was throbbing, but I couldn't worry about that now. I found a spot behind a boulder and started returning fire, trying to keep the enemy's heads down. It was a brutal fight. The Viet Cong had the high ground, and their aim was deadly accurate. We were outnumbered and outgunned, but we weren't going down without a fight. Then I saw it. One of the enemy soldiers crouched behind a tree, aiming an RPG at our position. My blood ran cold. If he fired that thing, we were all dead. I didn't think. I just acted. I lined up my shot and squeezed the trigger. The M16 barked, and the soldier went down. The RPG clattered to the ground, unexploded. "Nice shot, Timmons," someone yelled, but I barely heard it. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I was going to be sick. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the gunfire started to die down. The Viet Cong were pulling back, disappearing into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared. When it was over, we regrouped and took stock of the situation. 2 more of our guys were wounded, and one, Private Hendricks, was dead. Conway's face was a mask of grim determination as he gave the order to move out. We couldn't stay there. The enemy knew our position, and it was only a matter of time before they came back with reinforcements. As we trudged through the jungle, I couldn't shake the image of Hendricks lying there in the mud. He'd been just a kid, barely out of high school. It wasn't fair, but fairness didn't mean much out here. We kept moving until nightfall, finally stopping in a small clearing to set up camp. We took turns on watch, but sleep didn't come easy for any of us. The jungle was alive with sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. But every noise made me jump. I thought about my family back home, about my mom and dad and my little sister. They didn't know what it was like out here, and I hoped they never would. As I sat there in the darkness, clutching my rifle and staring into the shadows, I realized something. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I first came to Vietnam. The war had changed me, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be the same again. The days after the ambush in the ravine blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. We kept moving, following Conway's lead as he navigated us through the jungle. Each step felt heavier than the last, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The Viet Cong were always close, even if we couldn't see them. We felt their presence, like the jungle itself was watching us. By the 4th day, our rations were running low, and the heat was taking its toll. My arm was still stiff and sore from the blast, but Doc assured me it wasn't broken. "Just keep it clean," he'd said, handing me a roll of bandages. Easier said than done in a place where everything was wet and filthy. We were pushing through a particularly dense patch of jungle when we came across something that stopped us in our tracks, a downed helicopter. It was half buried in the mud, its tail section twisted like a piece of crumpled paper. The metal was scorched black in places, and the rotor blades hung at odd angles, broken and useless. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. The jungle had already started to reclaim the wreckage, with vines snaking through the shattered windows and moss creeping up the sides. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe longer. Inside, we found the remains of the crew. There were 3 of them, still strapped into their seats. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. They'd been left here, forgotten, in the middle of nowhere. Conway ordered us to search the area, and that's when we found the dog tags. I remember holding one in my hand, turning it over and reading the name, Sergeant Michael Kearns. It didn't mean anything to me at the time, but it felt wrong to leave them there. We collected the tags and buried what we could of the remains, marking the spot with a makeshift cross made from branches. It wasn't much, but it was all we could do. As we stood there, Conway said a few words, his voice low and steady. "They deserve to be remembered," he said. "No one should be forgotten out here." After that, we moved on, but the image of that wreck stayed with me. It was a reminder of how unforgiving this place was. One mistake, one stroke of bad luck, and you could end up just like those men. That night, as we set up camp, I couldn't stop thinking about the dog tags. I kept turning them over in my mind, wondering who those men had been. Did they have families waiting for them back home? Did they know what had hit them? Or had it happened too fast to feel anything? Conway must have seen the look on my face because he sat down next to me and lit a cigarette. He didn't say anything at first, just stared out into the darkness. "This war has a way of sticking to you," he said finally. "The people, the places, even the things you try to forget. They don't go away. You just learn to carry them." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. What could I say? He was right. The next morning, we reached the rally point, a small clearing where a helicopter was waiting to take us back to base. As we climbed aboard, I looked out at the jungle one last time. It felt like we were leaving a part of ourselves behind, something we'd never get back. The flight back was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts. When we landed, I handed the dog tags to one of the officers, hoping they'd make their way to the right people. It was a small thing, but it felt important. That was the last patrol I went on before my tour ended. When I finally got back home, the world felt different, quieter, smaller, and somehow less real. But the jungle, the faces of my squad, and the ghosts of that wreckage, they stayed with me. They're still with me, even now, all these years later. When I came home from Vietnam, I thought it would be like stepping into a different world, a place where everything was normal, where I could forget the heat of the jungle and the weight of the things we'd seen. But nothing felt normal. I remember walking off the plane and seeing my family waiting for me. My mom was crying, my dad trying to keep it together. They hugged me like it was a happy homecoming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong. It wasn't the way I thought it would be. I expected to be relieved, to feel like a burden had been lifted, but instead, I felt like I was floating outside myself, like I was looking at everything from a distance. People would ask me how it had been over there, but they didn't really want to know. They just wanted the short version, the kind of answer that made them feel better. Tough, I'd say. But I made it. That was the easy answer. The one that let people move on without having to face the reality of what we went through. At first, I tried to go back to a normal life. I took a job at a factory, worked the assembly line, but it never felt right. I couldn't concentrate. The sounds of machinery, the hum of the factory, it reminded me too much of the jungle, the way the air would hum with the anticipation of danger. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every loud noise made my heart race. I went to see a doctor after a while. Doc told me it was PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He explained it like it was some kind of illness, but to me, it just felt like part of me. It was the way I was now. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few pills or talking it out. I'd seen things that couldn't be undone, and no one could take that from me. I couldn't talk to my family about it. They didn't understand. They'd never seen what we saw out there. They'd never experienced that kind of fear, that kind of bond between men who depended on each other for survival. The kind of bond that had kept us going when we were so far from home, so far from any kind of help. The kind of bond that was broken when the last man was gone. The hardest part was the quiet. After all the noise of the war, the gunfire, the helicopters, the explosions, the silence was unbearable. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't relax. I'd be sitting at the dinner table, and suddenly my mind would flash back to something I saw in the jungle, something I'd rather forget. My wife, then girlfriend, could see it in my eyes. She'd ask if I was okay, and I'd just nod, telling her I was fine. But I wasn't. I wasn't fine at all. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It wasn't a nightmare, at least not one that I could explain. It was just a memory of feeling that I couldn't shake. The faces of the men we'd lost, the places we'd been, the things we'd done. I'd roll over and try to get back to sleep, but the images would be there, lurking in the dark. I learned to live with it. I had to. I eventually left the factory job. It wasn't the work, it was the feeling of suffocating under the weight of it all. I moved to a small town, thinking that being away from the noise might help. It didn't. The nightmares followed me. The memories followed me. It wasn't the same as being back in Vietnam, but it was close enough to feel real. Years went by, and I tried to move on. I got married, had kids, tried to be a good father. But every year, the anniversary of my deployment would hit me hard. I didn't talk about it, not to anyone. People didn't want to hear it. The war was over. The world had moved on. So I moved on too, in my own way. But the memories, the ghosts, they never left. I learned to carry them like a heavy pack on my back, never putting it down for too long. There were moments when I'd catch myself thinking of the guys I'd served with, the ones who didn't make it out. Ramirez, Hendricks, Conway, men who I had fought beside, men who had been with me in those darkest hours. I couldn't forget them, and I couldn't forget the bond we shared. Sometimes I'd go to the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., just to pay my respects. The wall is massive, and when you stand in front of it, it feels like the weight of all those names presses down on you. I'd find the names of the men I served with, the ones who never made it home, and I'd just stand there, my hand on the cold stone, trying to find some peace. It's been decades since I was in Vietnam, but the war never really leaves you. You don't come back the same. You can't. The men I fought beside, they're still with me, in my thoughts, in the quiet moments when I close my eyes. I carry them with me, always. It's just the price we pay for surviving.